Most professionals still believe replacement is loud. They picture a moment, a meeting gets scheduled, a calendar invite arrives with no agenda. A manager says something like reorg or efficiency or strategy. That mental model is outdated. What's happening now is quieter and far more final. Because AI doesn't replace you the way outsourcing replaced you. It doesn't even replace you the way software replaced you. It replaces the thing that made your role exist in the first place. Your process. Not your job title, not your identity, not your domain expertise. The process. And once a process no longer needs your participation, your role becomes optional. That's the shift most people refuse to see because it's insulting. It implies the company didn't hire you for what you know. It hired you because the system had friction. For decades, white-collar work existed because information moved slowly. Decisions required translation, execution required coordination, and coordination required humans to absorb ambiguity. Humans lived inside the gaps between steps. You weren't paid for output. You were paid to keep the sequence moving when the sequence couldn't move itself. That's what professionalism often meant. Not intelligence, not hustle, not talent. It meant you were the adhesive, the person who remembered what happened last week, the person who nudged the next owner, the person who explained the nuance, the person who created a workaround when the system stalled. AI doesn't automate a task first. It automates continuity. That's why it feels different. A task is discrete. A task is visible. A task is easy to argue about. Continuity is invisible. Continuity is the handoff. Continuity is the next step that used to live in your head. Once continuity gets automated, the organization stops waiting for you in 100 tiny ways. At first, this looks like efficiency. Fewer emails, fewer follow-ups, cleaner handoffs, faster approvals. Leadership celebrates it because it resembles maturity. They call it standardization. They call it operational excellence. They call it scale. But underneath, leverage is moving. When execution becomes automatic, supervision becomes cosmetic. And when supervision becomes cosmetic, authority dissolves. This is the phase where professionals still feel safe. They're busy, they're still on the invite list, they still deliver, they still get praise. But they're no longer controlling the bottleneck, because the bottleneck has been redesigned out of existence. That's the key distinction. Replacement isn't an event, it's a redesign. Once the sequence is machine legible, judgment turns into configuration. Experience turns into thresholds. Decision-making turns into routing rules. Oversight turns into monitoring. And the scariest part is that nothing dramatic happens. No one announces, "We no longer need that role." The role simply starts receiving fewer meaningful decisions. The work becomes lighter, and then emptier. This is how professionals get trapped. They interpret less friction as proof they're succeeding. But often, less friction is the system learning to route around them. Now, the second phase begins. Once planning gets automated, the job collapses inward. Not eliminated, compressed. Responsibility without leverage, accountability without control. This is why replacement feels invisible. The title still exists, the calendar is still full, the person is still employed, but the system has moved past them. And there's a deeper shift underneath that most people miss. When a process runs cleanly, it becomes politically untouchable. No one wants to slow it down. No one wants to be the person who questions the pipeline that works. So intervention starts to look like inefficiency. Human judgment becomes risk. Not because judgment is wrong, but because judgment is slower than the system. And once the system is faster, the organization begins to optimize around speed. This is where the real replacement actually happens. The system doesn't fire you. It routes around you. It stops asking for your sign-off. It stops waiting for your clarification. It stops depending on your coordination. Your inbox gets quieter. Fewer escalations, fewer approvals, fewer decisions that require your judgment. And many professionals mistake that quiet for stability. But stability is not the same thing as necessity. That's the trap of modern white-collar work. You can be excellent inside a process that no longer needs a human anchor. Excellence without leverage is fragile, because leverage is the only thing the organization protects. Not effort, not tenure, not reputation. When a system becomes clean, it becomes politically protected. No one wants to be the person who slows down what's working. So intervention starts to look like inefficiency. Human judgment becomes risk. Not because it's wrong, but because it's slower than the pipeline. And once speed becomes the benchmark, the organization quietly rewrites what good means. Good stops meaning accurate. Good stops meaning thoughtful. Good starts meaning fast, consistent, and auditable. That's why replacement is invisible. The title still exists, the calendar is still full, the person is still employed. But the system has moved past them. Now zoom out. The divide forming isn't between AI people and non-AI people. That's social media framing. The real divide is between professionals embedded in system design and professionals operating inside systems designed by others. If your value is keeping the process running, you're exposed. Because systems are learning to run themselves. If your value is deciding what the process should be, you gain optionality. Not job security, optionality. Because organizations can reduce headcount and still increase throughput. And once leadership sees that outcome once, it becomes permanent expectation. This is why performance doesn't protect you anymore. Loyalty doesn't protect you. Reliability doesn't protect you. Those traits mattered when humans were required to maintain continuity. When continuity becomes infrastructure, the reward system changes. The organization stops paying for people who keep it moving. It starts paying for people who decide what moves. Most professionals won't react to this shift. Not because they're incapable, but because nothing looks broken. Until one day they realize the system doesn't need their approval anymore. And by then, the replacement already happened. Here's the contrarian part. The most dangerous careers aren't the ones with weak skills. They're the ones built on being the human glue inside processes that are becoming self-healing.